This bill is pretty large. It's actually I think about almost $4 trillion worth of legislation, depending on who you ask. Of course, a lot of the Trump allies say no, this is going to be budget neutral. But at least two independent auditing agencies have found that it does actually cost at least somewhere between $3 and $4 trillion net. And they call it one big beautiful bill because at first there'd been some debate to split it up and pass it into different sections. By building it all into one bill, it makes it much more difficult for Republicans who have issues with certain parts of the bill to vote against it. And there are a lot of Republicans with issues. So some Republicans don't like the Medicaid cuts. So there's about $500 billion of cuts to Medicaid, which is the U.S. system for health care for the poor and the disabled. And the biggest of that is a requirement to prove that you work at least 80 hours a week in order to qualify for Medicaid moving forward. There's other portions of this bill. Originally, there'd been almost $800 billion worth of cuts, but those have been stripped out by the Senate parliamentarian as not germane to the bill, meaning that the bill has to be all involved in just the budget issues. And it's a very complicated process. So they're still voting on these things. There's also provisions in there that some Republicans don't like, having to do with a tax credit for homeowners that would allow them to deduct, particularly higher end homeowners, upwards of $40,000 a year of the value of their house. That's something that's also pretty controversial. So a lot of the fiscal conservatives are very unhappy with some of those provisions, like the one for homeowners. And then a lot of the sort of more moderate Republicans are very unhappy with the cuts to Medicaid. And so it's a really big balancing act to figure out, is there going to be enough political juice behind this to actually pass it through the Senate and then back again through the House once they've made all these changes?
Which they're currently doing. They're there at the Senate right now. What are they debating it, getting changes done? How much has the bill changed already?
So this is what we call a votorama, and I've covered a lot of these in my career. And there's usually, actually, it's very rare to have one during the day. It's usually held in the middle of the night, and you get anywhere from 30 to 50, in this case, hundreds of votes. And the senators all just sort of hang out for hours, and if not days, until all of those votes are finished. And so they're just voting on amendments as they come up. And any senator can introduce an amendment as long as it's germane to the bill. And you just sit there until they've gone through every single one. The leadership usually allows only a certain number through, but in this case, as you're building consensus, as you're trying to build more support for the bill, you're trying to get more people to sign on. And so some of these amendments are crucial in order to get their support. There's about 5 senators that are really swinging. 2 are hard-nosed, and they can only lose 3. So the other 3 senators that are debating whether or not they're going to vote for this bill, that's really important to get them on board. And so what you're seeing in a lot of these amendments are things for their states, things that might encourage them to sign up for this bill. And it's pretty much horse trading at this point.
Yeah, incredible. There's a lot of discussion about how much the bill adds to the nation's debt. People are calculating it differently, aren't they, and coming up with different numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you listen to House Speaker Mike Johnson, a Republican and an ally of President Trump's, he'll tell you that this bill is budget neutral and that it doesn't cost a penny. If you listen to Democrats, this bill costs $5 trillion. So there's a lot of differing estimates about how much this bill is actually going to cost. I think most journalists would say that the Congressional Budget Office estimate is probably the one that we would take most seriously. It's nonpartisan, and it's meant to be, and it's the one that's kind of been the gold standard for covering Congress for a long time. And they estimate they have it coming in at just under $4 trillion net over the next 10 years.
Is there much debate in the community about this? What do Americans think of what Trump is trying to push through?
You know, it's hard to tell. It's such a complicated bill. It has so many different sections, and there's a lot of folks who are very angry. Particularly, for example, I'm in New Mexico, which is a state that's between Arizona and Colorado, and we have the largest number of people on Medicaid in the union. So we have about 40% of our citizens are on Medicaid. Those cuts are very, very controversial in this state, and in a lot of the Republican states in the South that are also very Medicaid dependent, those cuts are pretty controversial. But then you hear a lot of Trump supporters here who just absolutely trust him, feel that this is the best thing for the country, and would say, are perfectly happy to take a cut on this level if it means supporting President Trump. So I think there's also just not a lot of information about it. This is a bill that passed the House. It's now passing the Senate. You're hearing more and more about these provisions as we go, but it's so huge. I mean, there's also cuts to food stamps. So, people who get food support from the government. There's making permanent all of his tax cuts from his first term. There's, provisions that have to do with renewable energy. And you've seen Elon Musk go on the warpath today and last night over those cuts because he's very angry. It'll hurt his businesses, particularly Tesla, if these cuts are passed. And so it's all these different parts make it really confusing to understand that it's all one bill and that and it's sort of like you have to support everything or nothing.